in research. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to House Order of June 23, 2022. Members are attending in person in the room, and we also have a few that are on Zoom, or at least one that's on Zoom today. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefits of the witnesses, and thank you to the witnesses for coming. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating on video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic. And when you're speaking, please speak slowly and clearly for the benefit of our translators, and thank you to our translators. When you're not speaking, if you can mute your mic, please. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice of, on the bottom of your screen, choosing floor, English, or French. And for those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. There. Reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. So pursuant to Standing Order 108.3.1 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, February 14th, the committee commences its study on the Government of Canada's graduate scholarship and postdoctoral fellowship programs. It's now my pleasure to welcome our witnesses. We have in person from the Canadian Association of University Teachers, Justine de Jager, Director of Political Action and Communications. And online we have from the Fédération Québécoise des Professeurs et Professeurs d'Université, Michel Lacroix, President and Treasurer. You each have a maximum of 5 minutes, after which we'll proceed to the rounds of questions. And I'll signal you when you're getting close to that 5-minute mark. And we'll get started with Ms. Jager. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
De Jager. Very
De
close.
Jager? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Chair, and good morning, everyone. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting, of course, on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. And thank you for studying this issue, which is critical for the future of Canada's success in research and science. I am grateful for the invitation to be here on behalf of the Canadian Association of University Teachers. CAUT represents over 72,000 faculty, librarians, and professional staff at more than 125 post-secondary institutions across the country. We work in the public interest to improve the quality and accessibility of post-secondary education in Canada. Universities, colleges, and polytechnics are essential to the preservation, dissemination, and advancement of knowledge for the benefit of all. Today's graduate students are tomorrow's leading researchers and are integral to Canada's research and science workforce. Although Canada and the world rely on this workforce to create the knowledge needed to improve quality of life and to face critical challenges, investment and planning is needed to ensure a flourishing research community today and tomorrow. The impact of ongoing neglect in this area includes, 1, the slowing of Canada's research and science talent pipeline, as low award values make it increasingly difficult for Canada to attract and retain young, talented researchers and innovators. 2, academia is less and less seen as a career. The shrinking number of jobs for highly trained researchers in fundamental science is a deterrent and a brain drain. In the words of one of our members in a recent survey on the state of the academic profession, quote, "I am losing pace with my research because the demands of my teaching intensive contract occupy so much time, and any research I do is not allowed on my contract. So I'm always having to find creative ways to stay involved in research and do my own research. If I had known academia was going to be like this, I never would have pursued a PhD." And third, delays to achieving greater equity, diversity, and inclusion. The limited data we do have for our sector shows that the greatest diversity of skilled researchers is overrepresented in part-time or part-year contract work and are therefore less likely to be engaging in research activities at all. In my remarks, I will focus on the importance of increasing fellowships and scholarships, including the pool of research grants, which are used to employ and train the vast majority of graduate students, and investing in workforce renewal. In a recent survey of our members, 65% of respondents rated the level of federal support for graduate student salaries as either poor or very poor. As we saw with the recent Support Our Science walkout and various job actions in our sector across the country, graduate students and postdoctoral fellows are at a breaking point. CAUT is in solidarity with these groups, and we echo their calls for more and better scholarships and fellowships. Research grants must also increase. Most students are not funded via scholarships and fellowships, but rather through research assistantships paid for by research grants. To improve student wages, increases are also needed to grant sizes and to the number of grants available. CAUT, to this point, supports the recommendation made in the Bouchard report to increase the Granting Council's core grant programming by at least 10% annually for 5 years. This would be a first step to improving compensation and giving research funding the boost it needs. Lastly, the issue of precarity and the need to renew the academic workforce cannot be ignored. To invest in graduate students, we must also grow our science and research workforce, and we are falling behind. At least 1/3 of faculty at Canadian universities and colleges are working in teaching-only contract positions. In the last decade, the number of university professors working part-time or part-year increased by 79%. In our survey of the state of the academic profession, the majority of these would like to work in a position that also supports their research. Moreover, the number of assistant professorship or early career research jobs in Canada has shrunk by 18% over the last decade. A workforce strategy is needed to support and nurture our next generation of talent. Canada is 26th in the OECD for graduate degree attainment. Without a strategy, it will be difficult for Canada to improve our standing and compete globally. It is time to act on the clear and plentiful evidence and expert recommendations that have been made on Canada's research funding ecosystem. To support the next generation of academics, thought leaders, researchers, and drivers of Canadian innovation, we urge the Government of Canada to increase the number and value of graduate student scholarships and postdoctoral fellowships, to increase research funding through the tri-council agencies, and to take a leadership role to work with provinces to address the lack of renewal of our science and research workforce. Thanks so much. I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you, Ms. De Jager. Right on time. Et maintenant, nous avons...
Now we'll listen to Mr. Lacroix for 5 minutes. You have the floor, sir. Thank you very much. I thank the Standing Committee on Science and Research for its invitation, and I am honored that I can follow in the footsteps of my colleague and comrade from CAUT. FQPPU represents 19 unions and associations of university professors in Quebec, which represent nearly 95% of the university teaching corps in Quebec. In addition to defending the interest of our members, our mission is to protect the university as a public service that is widely accessible and dedicated to the creation and transmission of knowledge, particularly critical knowledge. So it's these principles that guide my remarks to you today. The integration of graduate students into research and creation is a subject of great interest to university professors, not only because they will be the professors of tomorrow, who will, in turn, be responsible for universities and other institutions dedicated to inventing, promoting, and transmitting knowledge, but also because they will be the vectors of the dissemination of this knowledge in their professional practice, regardless of the milieu. The federal government has an important role to play in this regard through the Granting Council's student scholarship programs and research grants and chairs programs. However, some recent data and interventions indicate quite clearly that this support is not being deployed in a manner commensurate with contemporary challenges and potential. In this sense, we agree with the positions of CAUT, the Advisory Committee of the Federal Research Support System, and the Support Our Science movement, just to name a few. To allow as many graduate students as possible to fully engage in their research and to ensure that they can overcome the socio-economic barriers to accessing knowledge and the scientific community, the government must sustainably increase the amount of master's and doctoral scholarships and index them permanently. As you have heard here many times before, this amount has been stagnant for the past 20 years and is well below the threshold that would allow a single person to live above the poverty line. In an economy marked by employee shortages and inflationary pressure, this creates a structural pressure to work for food and to drop out of higher education. It also disadvantages people from the lowest income groups. The government must also ensure that the granting councils are able to offer significantly more student grants in all fields. To meet the future's cultural, ecological, economic, and social challenges, Canada will need as many people as possible to renew and disseminate knowledge. Finally, it's important to increase the total budget for grants awarded by the research councils, as these grants provide a significant portion of the financial support to students. To quote one of our members, research assistantships and fellowships come from faculty funding, but the amounts do not follow. I would add in closing that to promote greater accessibility and to distinguish more clearly between support for the next generation and recognition of the rarest excellence, the integration of the greatest number of people into research and the logic of prestige, the granting councils should aim to offer scholarships of similar amounts at the master's and PhD levels while using prizes to distinguish exceptional applications and careers. Also, support to the next generation of students. We have to underscore the fact that we have to give more scholarships in French, and we also have to consider more collaboration with provinces so that we can have a greater number of teachers and better management of these students, because the growth of lecturers hasn't followed with the growth of students. Thank you for your kind attention, and I am happy to answer any questions.
That's terrific. Thank you. Merci. And to both witnesses for your presentations. I know we'll have lots of questions. I was remiss in not welcoming Eric Murillo from the Conservative Party that's visiting us today. It's always good to have you in the room. And right now we'll start with the Conservative Party. The first speaker for 6 minutes is Mr. Soroka.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for coming today. I'll start off with Mr. Jagger there. We know we're lacking in funding here in Canada. I'm just concerned, though, are we able to still attract enough students or researchers into a field in Canada, or are they just going abroad seeking greener pastures, so to speak?
Yeah, that's absolutely one of the concerns is the brain drain factor. You look at, for example, funding for research in Germany, for example, 2 percentage points higher than in Canada, for example. And so, yes, we are seeing researchers move abroad for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is, of course, a lack of funding. I cited that OECD statistic. We are low ranked there in terms of grad degree attainment, and then also in terms of retention. And of course, feeding all of this, of course, is also just the cost of education generally, which is why indexing the graduate scholarships to inflation would be at least a first step in kind of addressing that gap that's created. But there also needs to be an injection of funds to play that catch up from 2003.
Do you feel because of this that universities are partnering with companies such as Huawei, where there's a potential security risk depending on what the research they're doing? Are they looking at this as simply as funding and just to survive versus flourishing?
Right. Again, concerning, right? Because over the last 3 decades, we've seen the progressive public underfunding of post-secondary education. In the early 90s, it was about 80% of revenues for post-secondary education came from public sources. Now that number is less than 50. And institutions are making up those revenues however they can, predominantly through tuition fees, predominantly, again, through what are generally deregulated international student tuition fees, and as you say, through partnerships, private partnerships in many cases with corporations either in Canada or abroad. And it's really threatening the kind of public nature of our institutions, the ability to protect academic freedom, and a number of the other values that we hold really to heart in our current system.
Still to Ms. Jagger, I'm not disputing that, we need more funding. That's not where I'm going with this. I just want to find out what other opportunities are there, such as patents, licensing, contracts with other private sectors. Is that an opportunity, or are we kind of beyond that because other companies are gone to other countries, basically, to get that type of research because there just isn't as much financial dollars or potentially researchers in Canada?
Right. I mean, in terms of kind of applied research with a particular kind of commercializable outcome, certainly there are better and worse ways of doing that in terms of partnerships. Certainly we'd want to see partnerships that protect academic freedom and protect scientific inquiry as distinct from kind of maybe the aims of the private company. But I think a bigger issue in terms of our need for research funding is that we're seeing basic investigator-led research really dwindle in favor of this more applied research, which is not to say it's not needed, but we're seeing really a shift in the balancing of those two streams. And, obviously we're coming out of a pandemic, and it's often been said that if we funded only applied research, we might have the best iron lung in the world, but we wouldn't have a polio vaccine. And I think that's really kind of a good point for where we are now is we want to, I think, look to solutions to partnerships with industry, and sometimes that can be part of the solution, but it doesn't make up for the gap in basic investigator-led research.
So then would you say that we're getting to the stage where we can do the research, I'll say fairly well, even though with the lack of funding, but that you can't take it to the next step for commercialization or work with a company because there just isn't that opportunity to go that much further? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying I think we've seen more funding as a proportion of total research funding go towards applied commercializable research efforts. I think what's lacking in our ecosystem research-wise is really, funding for both applied and investigator-led, but in particular, basic investigator-led research. That's where we're really lacking. And some of that research will result in commercializable outcomes, right? But by funding only or increasingly only, research with what is purported to have a clear commercializable aim, we are lacking some of that basic innovation.
Yeah, that's been a prime example during COVID. We've seen a lot of times, instead of going with researchers right here in Canada, we go abroad for our own needs. Do you feel that we're going to be losing out in the future to such opportunities where even Canadians don't even look to Canada to solve their solutions anymore? Is that a potential?
Absolutely, that's a concern, yes. It's getting harder and harder to imagine the incentive for really smart, innovative researchers to want to stay in Canada, given the kind of fact that we haven't seen an increase to their basic funding packages since 2003. Anecdotally, I received a Canada Graduate Scholarship 10 years ago, and the value of that scholarship is the same as someone going to grad school today. And of course, over the last 10 years, we've seen a huge increase in cost of living generally, and perhaps most poignantly in tuition fees, which has actually outpaced increases to both housing and food.
Is there some other opportunities? I know we've talked in the past about potential assisting students with housing to make that a little more cost effective for them to attend universities, or what other opportunities are there besides just direct funding?
We might have to hold that answer unless you can give it to us in writing. Maybe there will be another opportunity on the next question.
I'd appreciate if you could submit that, please.
But thank you. Thank you, Mr. Soroka, for the questions. Next up, we have Ms. Metledge-Diab from the Liberals.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and bienvenue à nos témoins ce matin.
Welcome to our witnesses this morning.
To both of you. Madame Diager, I'm going to actually allow you to answer that question because that was part of what I wanted to go with. I think we recognize on this committee that more funding is needed for graduate and postdoctoral and researchers in general and everyone. So let me get you to follow on what else can government or other than government do to help them other than direct funding? Is there anything else that we can do?
Absolutely. So, we're talking a lot about Canada's research ecosystem. So today the focus is on, scholarships and fellowships for graduate students and postdocs. And then we're also talking about basic research funding, right? Research funding through the tri-council agencies to ensure that our members in many cases are able to hire graduate students at fair wages on stipends to help conduct their research. So that's a big part of the research ecosystem. But beyond the research ecosystem, ecosystem, we have a bit of a general post-secondary ecosystem. And that's where, of course, there can be increased funding and ought to be increased funding for things like the Canada Social Transfer, which is currently how we provide operating funds federally to our post-secondary institutions. We'd like to see dedicated funding to our sector, not unlike the Canada Health Transfer, dedicated funding beyond the Canada Social Transfer for operational funds. And then, of course, an expansion to student grants programs generally, of course, will help with things like tuition fees. To the point about housing, again, yes, really acting on some of the things outlined in the National Housing Strategy, really ensuring that the specific needs of students are being met around maybe shorter-term rentals in oftentimes very high-rent areas that are associated with colleges and universities. So, it is really an issue that requires, I think, a multi-pronged approach and tackling it from multiple different angles, because it's ultimately about cost of living beyond just the need for kind of driving innovation in our research.
So let me have a follow-up, and then I'm going to ask you another one, but I'm going to ask them both at the same time because I don't want to run. I want to get answers on both of them. I want to know, how would this operational funding, if you had a stream of that or if it increased, how is that going to help these graduate and postdoctoral? But I also want you to comment in the last time that I would have with you, because I'm extremely interested in this. You talked about, and I wrote it down, the shift in the balancing of the two streams, and you described it as applied commercialization research versus the basic investigative-led research. And I'm extremely interested in the latter. So can you give us example of the second one, because I think it's very valuable, very important. And how would you then talk about, for those that are doing research, but also doing teaching in our institutions? And the value of that, but also the conflict, and what can you tell us, to help us in this committee?
Well, in short, an increase in public operational funds for colleges and universities ought to result, and it has historically resulted in lower tuition fees, right? Because institutions aren't having to seek out those private user fees, private partnerships, et cetera, to fund the basic mandate of the institution. To your point about basic investigator-led research, the example we like to go to, it's obviously very timely, it has been for a long time, of course, but is around vaccine technologies, right? The basic science underpinning mRNA vaccines, and really all vaccines, has been the result, really largely, of research that has been investigator-led, that has not been, strictly directed in terms of a particular outcome. Of course, they've had wonderful outcomes, in this case, vaccines. But we need scientists and researchers to be able to kind of conduct that research in an unfettered manner in order to make the really innovative discoveries that have fueled things like vaccines, for example.
We have a bit of more time. So I guess, are these researchers paid the same when it comes to, because you talked about the shift in the balancing. Are you talking about the funding? Are you talking about the value that society is seeing in all of these? Because obviously, are we looking too much to commercialize everything these days? I guess, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of the funding received by researchers, doesn't necessarily differ too much whether it's kind of investigator-led or applied. The difference is what strings are attached to receiving those funds. So, are they required to, establish a particular outcome that is commercializable or not? Is it kind of narrowly confined to a particular research area? Things of that nature. And again, it's not to say that, many commercializable innovations in our society have been the result of basic research, right? But it's just a question of whether we're framing the nature of the research at the outset of providing funding. And that's okay in some cases, but we think it's gone too far in that direction.
And what about this research and teaching?
Yes. So a big issue for our members, of course, is that an increasing number of Canadian academics are working from contract to contract, right, from semester to semester. And those contracts generally are teaching-only contracts. So there's no research as part of that academic job. And really the heart of the academic job traditionally has been a mix of research, teaching, and service.
Great.
And we believe that's the model to move forward with, and it's one that's being eroded.
Great, thank you very much. Maintenant, nous avons...
Now we give the floor to Mr. Blanchette Jean-Carl. You have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. I want to, first of all, greet the witnesses that are here today. Mr. Chairman, it's been 20 years that these scholarships have not been indexed. I want to challenge you, Mr. Chairman, to find something that has not been increased over 20 years. We posed this question to government and we're waiting for the answer. I think they're still looking for something that hasn't changed. It's been 20 years that we haven't been supporting scientific research, and the stakes are very high in this regard, especially when we look at the consequences, and we can talk about those all day. Economic precarious life, mental health, a shortage of manpower, brain drain. If there are no graduate or postdoctoral students, it means there will be no innovation, there will be no research, and there will be, of course, a loss of scientific sovereignty. I also know that there was a study that was done in 2016 that said that there was a problem with higher education in Canada. And now, because we want to have a good picture, we have the Bouchard report that was published in 2023, talked about scholarships again. And it says that it hasn't followed through with the increase in life and standard of living, and this has eroded the position of Canada as a hub attracting the best talents, and this erosion will be accelerated with an increase of investments by our international peers. I'm not the one who is saying this, Mr. Chairman. This is the report of our own government, ordered by our own government, so I can speak extensively about it, and I can give you concrete examples why Canada is in trouble and why it is urgent that we act. Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to do this study today, but I don't know how many studies we have to do, how many reports, how many consultations, how many committee meetings before the government understands that if it doesn't act now, then it would be too late. While our neighbors, while our competition, because, scientific research is not just in a silo, it's not done in private, it's on the international scene, and people are grabbing the best minds out there. So while our competition are in a race for the best, we are simply crawling. Anyway, I will continue, Mr. Chairman, and ask some constructive questions about what the situation is today. And I want to ask Mr. Lacroix. Mr. Lacroix, I'm happy to see you here today. You said it's not only necessary to increase federal scholarships, but we have to generally increase the funding of research, because many students do not receive funding from the federal government, but really from their departments. So what would be the consequence for these researchers if the government continues to increase the amount of scholarships? Thank you for your question. One of the potential consequences if there is an increase in scholarships without increasing funding of grants, what will happen is there would be a huge gap between those students who have scholarships and all those other students who are only receiving funding from research subsidies. So it's already difficult for us to get them through to complete their education, and they really need support, because this is a financial issue. They really want to reduce the precarious situation they are found in, and it's also a concern at the scientific community's level, whereby they want to contribute to the research of their teachers want to contribute to their research. So, Mr. Lacroix, do you have some statistics about those who receive funding from the federal and those who receive from their departments and those who do not receive any at all? Unfortunately, I don't have those figures with me, but I can transfer that information to you as soon as possible, because there's federal grants, there's provincial grants, and there are student scholarships and also contract-based grants. So you have to ask yourself the questions, is it only loans and grants from the federal level or is it from the provincial level? We have to divide those categories. So, Mr. Lacroix, I'm going to specify that to you. Anything federal scholarships. I would like that information. Now let's continue. The research from Statistics Canada about those who are receiving grants from post-secondary education means that graduate students need 2 or 3 years to finish their degree, and postdoctoral students need about 4 years. So the general average for the learning period for graduate students is about 2 years and 3 years for postdoctoral. So what happens to those students who take more time to determine their program? Do we need to extend the period covered by these scholarships? I'm sorry, I'm getting some feedback. Yes, it would be a good idea to make sure that these scholarships are not simply interrupted midway through the learning process of these students. It's a complex issue, but it's very clear that in general, 3 years is not enough for a doctoral student. I just want to remind Mr. Lacroix that I would like a written answer. Thank you.
Richard Cannings from the NDP.
Well, thank you, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I'm going to start with Ms. DeJager. We all agree here, I think, that the fact that these scholarships and fellowships haven't increased in 20 years it's unbelievable. And but there are many other factors that aggravate that. There are many other factors behind what universities are going through, what students are going through, what your members are, the teachers and professors. So I just want to go back and look at some of the historical context. And you touched on this, I think, in your just a few minutes ago, but you mentioned how that historically the government investment in post-secondary education has been declining. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's gone down from like 75% to 45%. And with that, we have rising tuition. There's some figures around the inflation that's happened in the last 20 years. But I'm just wondering if you have more specific inflation numbers for students, because they are looking at housing, they're looking at food, and they're looking at tuition, and tuition has gone up astronomically. But do you have numbers that combine those three things and compare it to real inflation and what these scholarships should be going up, what rate they should be increased?
Absolutely. So yes, since the early 90s, we saw a major cut to the Canada Social Transfer, from which Canadian post-secondary just has never recovered. It's been a steady decline in public funding as a share of total revenue for universities and colleges since then. And as I said earlier, the difference is being made up for predominantly by tuition fees and increasingly by international student tuition fees. Yes, we issued a report, which I'm happy to share with the committee, last year on the affordability of post-secondary education, and it did find that tuition fees over that same period have well outpaced increases to both housing and to food, which housing, I think notably, of course, has also well outpaced the cost of inflation. So that's, I think, telling. So really, what we've been advocating for on the graduate student scholarships point of things is we would like to see the awards increased by $185 million in 2023, and then an additional $55 million per year ongoing to increase both the value and the amount total of awards. And we do also support our science asks around indexing those awards to inflation to make sure that we're at least addressing and capturing inflation moving forward.
And just moving now to the idea of the brain drain. I mean, I've seen statistics, 38% of Canadian graduate students end up going overseas for various reasons. Part of that is funding for research, maybe there's other factors like the precarity issues that you talked to. Do you have more information on that as to why students are moving overseas and the loss that we are facing because we've invested millions of dollars in educating these people?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we can share more data as well, but I'll say anecdotally from the recent survey we conducted of members, part of it also is there's kind of a pipeline of academics, if you will, of, early career researchers, of graduate students who become kind of ideally Canada's full-time academics in the future. But we've seen an erosion of, in addition to the erosion of the kind of real value of graduate student scholarships, we've also seen an erosion of that academic job. And so even students who perhaps want to pursue their graduate studies in Canada, they're looking down the road and saying, well, this is not an industry in which I can have a career in Canada, and so I'm going to build my skills up elsewhere. Because, again, we're seeing it's now roughly a third of contracts have no research at all for our members and are determined from semester to semester, right, contract to contract. There's absolutely no job security there. And so, it's all part of the same conversation. The graduate student scholarships absolutely need to increase, but we also need to protect the nature of the academic job in Canada to make sure that folks want to do their research, their innovative research here as well.
1 minute. Okay, one more question then, and that is, the United States has always been our competitor, neighbor, etc. Can you comment on recent investments the United States have made into research, specifically in universities, and how that compares to Canada and how that might exacerbate the situation we find ourselves in?
Yes. So yeah, under the Biden administration, there have been significant investments made to research, and including to basic research. I'll also note that the stipends for graduate students are substantially higher in the United States. The common, retort we'll hear to that is, of course, tuition fees are higher in the United States. But that is actually increasingly shrinking if we look at the public colleges and universities in the United States, rather than also having data that encompasses the private system. Stipends for postdocs, for example, in the United States are $53,000 a year, for example, whereas they're $45,000 here. And so that is a pretty significant difference.
Thank you. Thank you. Now we'll go to our next round of 5 minutes each, and starting off with Mr. Tucker from the Conservatives.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you for the witnesses for the testimony so far. Starting with Madame de Jager, you talked about inflation, and we know that right now 1.5 million Canadians right now are relying on the food bank. 1 in 4 Canadians are missing meals to deal with the runaway inflation. What are the stories are you hearing from your members and students about how they're dealing with inflation?
Yeah, I mean, it's huge. And speaking to graduate students specifically, as I say, they have that additional burden of these tuition fees that have just absolutely been skyrocketing above even the cost of housing. But the cost of housing is huge. The cost of groceries is huge. And so, a lot of times it does come down to, am I going to choose between groceries or, paying my rent this month? We do hear those stories. And it's really a shame because we want those folks, we want our members, we want graduate students who will hopefully become our members to be able to focus on their studies, on their research work that is hopefully going to create the innovations that we need to address some of these major issues that we're facing, from climate change to food security to any number of issues. That's where we'd like to see their energies focused, right, and not in making kind of basic ends meet.
You talk about rent, and we know that nationally it's doubled in the last 8 years, doubling of rent. Does that impact the students' ability to conduct themselves? Like, you hear stories of typically you have a roommate in university or as you study. Have you heard of them additional students being added to rental units just to make the ends meet, or how are students actually making the ends meet then?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a higher proportion of students who are, living with more and more roommates, certainly, in smaller and smaller spaces. We hear this a lot, in particular, from international students who are paying 3 to 4 times more in tuition fees, of course, every year, and so face that higher amount of cost of living. Yep, it's all part of the cost of living challenge, and a big way we can address it, at least around this table, is by increasing the direct funding that these students get. Of course, there are other ways to tackle these many issues, including supporting housing initiatives, but that's one concrete way that we can support students.
And the next government, would you, if you had two choices, one, index the supports that they are now, but have a new government that doesn't worry about inflation, or have a government that keeps inflation flat? Which two scenarios would you prefer?
Well,
or which one, I guess?
I'm going to provide perhaps an annoying answer in that we actually, again, it's a serious issue that we're seeing in our sector, and we can't, dilute it to one solution. At the end of the day, we need to be looking at cost of living across the board, certainly housing, certainly food, and certainly tuition. But we also need to be looking at direct funding and making sure that they're at least keeping pace with inflation, and ideally addressing the backlog in funding, right, from 2003 onwards. So I am afraid I cannot choose one. I think it's going to require many solutions.
We're hearing this, the desire for change, because one, the inflation hasn't, the indexing of supports have eroded all the buying power and research abilities in our university facilities, and there's more and more groups believe that we're on the wrong path right now. We can't have runaway inflation at the rate that we are right now, because it affects every part of our society. And many times people don't think of students or faculty in universities, but it is more challenging. Is there a region in Canada that is doing better than other regions right now, be it in a province or a specific institution that could be held up as more of a poster child, may use that verbiage, of what other institutions should be looking at, such as switching some of the dollars that's spent from administration more to teaching? Is there examples like that you're aware of?
25 seconds.
Honestly, across the board, we're seeing this challenge. There's not kind of really a standout province. I would maybe, if we look to Quebec, for example, there are some additional pathways to permanence for contract academic staff through the chargé de cours system. So that's perhaps worth highlighting, and I'm sure my colleague could speak to that as well. Again, it's not enough. We ultimately need to see more pathways to permanency for academics across this country, and we know that that's something they want in the survey data that we have.
Thank you so much for that.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Mr. Lauzon, 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. First of all, I want to thank the two witnesses for being here today. I would have loved to be in person, but I have a small cough, so I'd rather stay away. My question would be to you both, Mr. Jagger and Mr. Lacroix. Looking back at the first witnesses that we had on this study, we had student associations who came and testified. They talked about inequalities in the scholarships, in the way the scholarships are distributed. They talked about mental health. They also talked about funding, as you did. They also talked about the scholarship system. So I'm going to go one at a time. I'll start with Mr. Lacroix. Can you talk a little bit about if you perceive that the students who mobilized to say there was inequality in the sharing of scholarships, did you perceive that? Because you didn't talk about it in your recommendations. Can you talk more about that? Mr. Lacroix? Yes. My second recommendation, saying that there should be an increase in the scholarships, would compensate some of this inequality. Something I also underscored was providing some financial resources. For example, the Vanier scholarship is higher than others, so we needed to be able to distinguish between student scholarships that ensures that all students can fully focus on their research, and if we want to now highlight the exceptional qualities of some candidates, then we can give them prizes instead of scholarships. That way, there will be more equality among the students. So you agree with me that we can improve on policies in terms of reforming the scholarships programs. Maybe we can contribute to improving the systems with such recommendations. But I want to know why in your recommendations you didn't talk, or you spoke very little about those systems that need to be revisited, because you laid emphasis on the finances and not on how we can do it. Can you talk about that? Okay. How? Since funding is limited, it will, of course, generate hyper-selective processes. And so there's a problem there. So if we increase the money awarded to scholarships, that can help counteract that situation. And then we have to be able to support all graduate and postdoctoral fellows. Maybe we can go in that direction so that every student in higher education can be a full-time researcher. Thank you. Mr. Jagger, you talked about the impact that students are suffering from now, and it wasn't the same in the last decade. Housing crises, rent hikes, food prices that have increased, and that puts some additional pressure on these students. And you said in your recommendations that you would like to see a 40% increase in Canadian scholarships in 2023-2024. But in your recommendations, you talked about it, but you didn't say it in your recommendations to review everything that has to do with housing and food for students. So can you talk a little bit more about that, Mr. Jagger? Yes, of course. Our recommendations today have to do with funding for scholarships at graduate and postdoctoral level. But of course, in the Trans-Canadian Social Reform, which we hope will be in 2024, we will certainly make broader recommendations with respect to the post-secondary system in terms of transfers to provinces, in terms of scholarships for students. So yes, these are recommendations that we will submit. And as I said before, it is a post-secondary system and not only a post-secondary research system. So we have to finance both systems in the best way possible. Mr. Jagger, can you talk about mental health a little bit more regarding all the phenomena that you have witnessed? Can you tell us what you feel, what you have perceived with respect to the students who are facing such difficult conditions?
On that excellent question. Now we're going to move to 2.5 minutes, starting with Mr. Blanchet-Choca.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je reviens.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Lacroix, with respect to my request, can you submit to the committee clerk the number of students in graduate and postdoctoral level who are receiving federal scholarships and those who are receiving provincial scholarships and those researchers who don't receive anything? So just to do a comparison. So Mr. Jagger, if you can, please share that as well. If you have that data, it's going to give us a good picture and to be able to make recommendations in the end. Mr. Lacroix, you also talked about the importance of highlighting the recommendations of the Bouchard report, the report of the Consultative Committee on research that was done by the federal government that required a 10% increase over the 10 years to come. So I want you to highlight the importance of increasing scholarships and indexing them, of course, but also how do we ensure that we can really do this with the resources that we have with the tri-councils? Thank you very much. As my colleague has just said, it is a system and all elements are important. And with respect to supporting the next generation, every subsidy is important, whether it's with stipends or otherwise. And in many universities, there are scholarships that are created by sharing part of the research subsidies. There are many universities in Quebec where researchers agree to provide through their subsidies and their grants scholarships to students. And so if it's not increased, there will be less and less students who will be able to benefit from these scholarships through research grants. Thank you. How much time do I have, Mr. Chairman? Okay, 35 seconds. Mr. Lacroix? The importance, very quickly, concretely, the importance of increasing and indexing these scholarships to catch up. What is important and what's the significance to do it now? The consequence would be quite broad, and it's very, very important. I would really highly recommend everyone to do that.
Mr. Cannings for 2.5 minutes.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to turn to Mr. Jager again, and following on that same question about the fact that although we're talking mainly about the scholarships and fellowships that haven't been increased in 20 years, that's just a portion of the grad students' funding, where they get their pay for doing that research, and a lot of it comes directly out of researchers' grants that are, again, supplied by the same tri-councils. And that's why most groups have been saying we can't just increase and index these scholarships. We have to increase the number and amounts of the actual research grants. And I'm just wondering, first of all, is there any relationship, or do you have any data on the pay that students get from within those grants versus from the scholarship and fellowship track? Are those, I guess, are students paid kind of based on what the researchers see the other students are getting?
Yeah, and we could certainly pull some data for you. I don't have that in front of me, unfortunately. But absolutely, a big part of this has to be research funding through the tri-council agencies, because a majority of the funding that graduate students received is not through these direct scholarships, which are, of course, valuable as well, but is through research stipends paid for by faculty, by academic staff. And so, and the reality is that research funding is also not indexed to inflation. And so we've seen our members having to pay, lower and lower stipends, or hire fewer graduate students at higher stipends to do the same work. And so again, it's both sides of the same coin, really, in terms of underfunding.
And my apologies if I missed this in your testimony, but do you have specific recommendations around those research grants? I know the U15 group wanted to see them doubled, for instance. Do you have, does CAUT have specific asks about that?
Yeah, so we do endorse the recommendations actually made by the Bouchard report, which was cited earlier. Yeah. So that's a 10% increase annually for the next 5 years. We'd like to see also funding ongoing from there. So we recommended at least $185 million ongoing in terms of increased funding. Plus, I would say also some additional funding for EDI initiatives, Dimensions Program, et cetera. Okay,
thank you. And now we have time for 2.5 minutes, for one for the Conservatives and one for the Liberals. So Mr. Tucker?
Sharing my time with Maxime. Maxime, you can have the 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, cher collègue.
Thank you, dear colleague. Mr. Chairman, I'll continue asking questions to Mr. Jagger. I listened to what you said, Mr. Jagger. What was most saddening to me is the fact that you said that you may not have done your graduate studies in the current conditions because the financing is very inadequate, and that's very saddening. So what messaging are we sending to the future generation? What message are we sending to our young Canadians when we are placing them in a precarious situation, in a difficult situation that harms their mental health? Because I think that was a very important comment that Mr. Jagger said there. And with all the data presented, you presented a clear picture. So, Mr. Jagger, can you tell us the role that graduate and doctoral students are playing in laboratories and in research in general? Well, it's completely required for research. It's very important, the research that our members are doing, because, our members in academic profession, they have service responsibilities, they have research work to be done as well, ideally, and they also have to teach in classrooms. So it is absolutely required, and we would like to see more funding for these research scholarships in general so that our members don't have to choose between paying several graduate students at a low salary or to employ just one or two at a higher salary. Thank you very much. We think that students are just being trained during their higher education, but they're doing much more than that. They are actively contributing to scientific research, to learning and research and training, and that is being used in our universities. So to you, what do you think would be the threats to our Canadian academic systems if our students abandoned researching in our country? Well, I wanted to also mention that Francophone researchers working in a minority situation, like in the Laurentian University, we saw that there was a situation of underfunding that created a situation where our Francophone researchers who are in a minority situation lost their jobs, lost scholarships, research grants. This is why we have to talk about the post-secondary system much more, as well as the research system.
If you can wrap us up, 2.5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and welcome. Mr. Jager, I want to address the issue of housing that you raised earlier. So we've heard from witnesses, a number of recommendations in terms of increasing the value of contributions, increasing the number of people who receive graduate scholarship, postdoctoral fellowship program support. So there'll be some consistent recommendations that flow through to the committee, and we'll have certainly some discussion about that later. One thing we haven't looked at, though, is support from other ministries in terms of how we can assist graduate students with their studies and with the cost of living issues that they're dealing with. And you mentioned housing. McMaster in my university is just finishing an $80 million 30-story building in downtown Hamilton to support postgraduate students. It's become a recruiting issue for the university when students can't find housing. They look for other opportunities. And so how can the government assist in terms of providing housing support outside of the traditional funds that and programs that we're talking about with all witnesses? How do we look to other ministries to provide support to ensure that those housing issues or affordability issues that you referenced earlier can be addressed in a more wholesome way?
Sure. I won't profess to be a housing expert, but I understand that certainly, improving the supply of affordable housing in Canada is absolutely crucial, right? That will help drive prices down and ultimately provide more Canadians a safe place to stay, to live, including students, and including I would draw particular attention to international students who are here, sometimes recruited with largely a false promise of, a safe place to live while they're pursuing their studies, and then end up in rooming houses that are just overcrowded and pretty terrible conditions. And so I'd really look to housing advocates who have spoken to this, I'm sure, more eloquently than I can, but certainly increasing the housing supply in Canada has to be a major part of that, including in areas where there are post-secondary institutions.
And with that support, look at providing financial support to post-secondary institutions as it relates to their projects that they have underway in the area of housing?
It could, yeah, absolutely. Envelope funding for housing, I think, could go a long way. At the end of the day, though, ideally, we'd like to see a system where institutions are funded adequately to provide all of its operations, including its core academic ones, but things like housing as well. And so we are looking forward to the Canada Social Transfer Review next year.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you to Ms. De Jager and also to Mr. Lacroix for your testimony, the great questions, great answers, and I know the analysts will be doing their job to pull this all together for us. You can submit any additional information to the clerk if we haven't covered everything that you'd like to have us covered, but we're going to suspend briefly to change panels. If you're online, if you can stay on, if you're a member of Parliament, I guess Mr. Lauzon, and the rest, we'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you. It's great to have the witnesses here in person and also a gallery full. So welcome to the people that are also witnessing the witnesses. So pursuant to Standing Order 108.3.1 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, February 14th, 2023, the committee resumes its study on the Government of Canada's graduate scholarship and postdoctoral fellowship programs. It's now my pleasure to welcome our witnesses. As an individual, we have Sarah Laframboise, Executive Director, Support Our Science. We have from the Canadian Black Scientists Network's Médian Adrad, Professor. And we also have two people from Science and Policy Exchange, Gavin Douglas, who's co-president, and Julia Messina Pacheco, who is vice president. You'll each be given a maximum of 5 minutes for your remarks for each of the groups being represented, after which we'll proceed to the rounds of questions, and I'll signal you when we're getting close to time. At the end of the meeting, we're going to have we have a request for project budget that we'll have to go through, so we're going to have to leave a few minutes at the end of the meeting so that we're able to do that. So looking at about 12:55 to wind things up. So for now, we will start off with our first witness, which will be Sarah Laframboise as an individual.
Hi there, good afternoon. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Sarah Laframboise, and I am a PhD student studying biochemistry at the University of Ottawa. I'm also an executive director of Support Our Science, which is a grassroots organization unified under the mission of increasing funding for graduate students and postdocs in Canada. I'm honored to be here today and would like to thank this committee for their work in honor of science and research. I had the pleasure of speaking to you on your top talent study almost exactly a year ago, and I'm thankful to the committee for including our calls for graduate students and postdocs in that report. It is frustrating, however, that in the last year since my appearance, there has been no action by our government to solve these problems. During this time, we had 7,000 scientists and 40 scientific associations sign an open letter. We had 3,500 signatures on a petition that MP Richard Cannings delivered to the House of Commons. We rallied on Parliament Hill in August. We spoke to MPs, ministers, media, and the public about our cause and sent over 2,000 emails to our MPs. But this wasn't enough. Budget 2023 contained no new funding for graduate students and postdocs. Last week, nearly 10,000 graduate students, postdocs, faculty, and supporters walked out of 46 different institutions across Canada. And today I brought some of them from the Ottawa crew with me today, and I'll ask them just to stand for a moment. They should all be doing their research right now. They should be in their labs. I should be in my labs. But we all came here today to show you how critical this is to our community. Many of these students helped me launch a national survey investigating graduate student finances, which painted a bleak but very clear picture of the financial realities of being a graduate student in Canada. 86% of graduate students have experienced stress and anxiety about their finances. Nearly 40% of students have difficulty paying for necessities like rent and food. And 31% have considered leaving their schooling due to financial concerns. For a country who boasts about our innovation, this is unacceptable. While other young adults are starting families and investing in their future, graduate students and postdocs are struggling to just get by. You will hear many times in these meetings that the scholarships for graduate students and postdocs have not changed in 20 years. But what exactly does this mean for Canada? This means that every day we're losing our highly trained scientists to the United States and Europe, where they don't have to live in poverty and will make 2 to 3 times more money than they would here in Canada. This means that our businesses are losing highly skilled workers. This means that every day we are failing Canadian innovation by defining who can take on the financial challenges of higher education and excluding those who can't. This is a lost potential on a personal level and a national level. 11 years ago, I decided to pursue a career in science. As a first-generation student, I self-funded my education and took on $100,000 in student debt to be where I am today. When my partner and I hit difficult times early on in my master's degree, I nearly had to drop out of my program when I couldn't make my tuition payments. I'm 28 years old this year, and I can't buy a home because I don't have an income in the eyes of a bank. I've often worked 2 to 3 jobs at a time to subsidize my income. I have no savings, and I rely on my partner's income for stability. I look around me, and my peers and family think I'm the smart one, but in reality, I feel like the one left behind. I am just one example, but there are thousands more with their own stories of struggle, inequality, and crippling debt. Some have gone as far as living in vans and doing clinical trials just to make ends meet. Every year the government doesn't invest in graduate students and postdocs, we are telling the brightest minds in our country that they don't matter, that they don't belong in Canada. I would like to end my remarks with some clear and strategic recommendations. First, we ask that scholarships and fellowships be increased by 50% to match inflation over the last 20 years, and index these awards to prevent them from this happening again in the future. These scholarships set a benchmark for how much we should award the best scholars in Canada. Second, we ask for a 50% increase in the number of graduate student scholarships and to double the number of postdoc fellowships to allow for more to benefit from these awards directly. Lastly, we call on the government to implement the Bouchard Report and increase funding to the Tri-Councils by 10% per year for the next 5 years in order to increase grant funding, and this will allow the increases to graduate student and postdoc pay through their supervisors, leading a lasting impact on the whole community. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you, Ms. Laframboise. And now for 5 minutes, Ms. Andrade from the Black Scientists Network.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for inviting me here. I'm a university professor at the University of Toronto. I'm also here as the president and co-founder of the Canadian Black Scientists Network. I represent over 600 Black people in Canada who are pursuing or who have higher degrees in STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, medicine, and health. They work across the country and across sectors. I'm here because I want to emphasize that supporting and fostering the work of emerging scientists is critical for Canada's innovation ecosystem, and that we're at a breaking point. This is what was stated quite clearly in the Advisory Panel on Federal Research Support Systems report from 2022, and so I'm going to take that as a given. We are at a breaking point. I'll also take as a given the government's repeated emphasis on the importance of science and innovation for addressing the pressing global challenges that are affecting Canada as other countries and ensuring that we remain competitive on an international scale. But the piece that seems to be missing from all of this is the understanding of how research actually gets done on the ground and how innovation arises from research. In fact, it is the majority of the hands-on research is being done by graduate students and postdoctoral fellows in our system. And I can say without hesitation in the sciences, this is the pattern in every single major research university and lab in the country, every single one. So it's graduate students and postdocs who spend most of their time at the bench or in the field, and they are the backbone of our science and innovation ecosystem now, and there are the potential for us to be successful in the future. Once that's understood, it should be clear that investing in infrastructure or large research consortia is simply not enough. In the end, it's the people who actually do the work who will ensure success of those investments. So when the government asserts that science and innovation is a priority by pointing to things like CFI or CFREF, their words ring hollow. And that's because right now, instead of supporting the people who are doing the work within those constructs, supporting their continued excellence, we are pushing them out of science by paying them poverty-level wages. Our current system is a massive filter. It is a filter that is filtering out people as a function of their finances, not as a function of their excellence, not a function of the likelihood that they might be the next Canadian Nobel Prize laureate. We're filtering out people who can't take the mental load of living in poverty, those who don't have credit ratings that allow them to take out loans, those who are unable to manage incredibly challenging research agendas while holding down several jobs. We're filtering out mature students who have dependents, and we're filtering out anyone whose family can't help support them through this without massive debt. We know in Canada that Black families, many families in rural communities, Indigenous families, and others from marginalized groups simply do not have the financial resources to allow their children to follow this path. We've built a system where, as you heard, more than 40% of graduate students describe their situation as tight or struggling. For Black students, that goes to up above 50% of students. Recently, a friend said to me, "I know you're passionate about this. I went to the March for Support Our Science, one of two I've been to in my 53 years, so I'm not a regular demonstrator. They said, what would you say to a struggling single mother in rural Canada who says, why should my taxes pay the salary of someone doing something I couldn't dream of doing? And I would say, do you want your children to be able to pursue that if they have talent? In 2023 in Canada, regardless of your financial situation. And that is not just for that child, that is for the benefit of Canada, because novelty and innovation lives in every community. I was born in Jamaica. My family immigrated here when I was a little above 2. And I was fortunate in that I knew my parents supported my education. And when I discovered a passion for biology, I know that they would have gone into debt to help me get through graduate school. But I was fortunate that I got a large fellowship from NSERC, the largest one they offered at the time, just a little over $21,000, 31 years ago. A master's student starting now, $17,500, less than I made 31 years ago. And even with that fellowship, when I finished my PhD at Cornell, and I thought, you know what, I'd like to start a family, it was a choice. If I want to do a postdoc and have a family, I have to stay in the United States because Canada will not compensate me in a way that will allow me to start a family. I was fortunate that I was hired at U of T and I didn't have to make that choice. A lot of people do, and they leave Canada. We are losing talent by the bucket load under the current system. And that's why the Canadian Black Scientists Network joins with our colleagues. You just heard that we're all in alignment, actually, with these requests, with these demands, with the Bouchard report. We need to have an increase to the support for our emerging scientists. The government's own advisory panel said the current support for graduate students, the researchers of tomorrow, is at a breaking point, which is where I started. As we have this conversation, critical to center the knowledge that that breaking point is the breaking point for our science and innovation ecosystem. Okay. Join us in making sure that we can reverse that.
Thank you very much. And now Mr. Douglas or Ms. Messina Pacheco, the floor is yours for 5 minutes from Science and Policy Exchange.
Thank you, Honorable Chair and esteemed committee members, for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Julia Messina Pacheco. My colleague, Dr. Douglas, and I are here today representing Science and Policy Exchange, a nonprofit advocacy group run by graduate students and postdoctoral fellows in Montreal. Our aim is to foster the voices of the next generation of researchers in evidence-based decision-making at the interface of science and policy. But I'm also speaking to you today as a PhD candidate who has dedicated 12 years to pursuing post-secondary education. And of those 12 years, I have spent 7 as a graduate student. That is 7 years that I, along with the vast majority of graduate students in Canada, have been under-supported and forced to make difficult financial compromises. My own research focuses on pancreatic cancer, a devastating disease that affects thousands of Canadians and their families every year. And I have devoted years of hard work to studying this disease because I am passionate about improving patient outcomes, and I am also driven by a genuine love for science. However, this passion and pursuit of knowledge have left me in a situation where I struggle to afford necessities such as rent, groceries, and the ability to start a family. It takes many years to earn a master's or doctoral degree, and the process is much more like a job than traditional schooling. The support provided through stipends and fellowships should offset the cost of living, enabling us to focus on the research that Canada depends on. It is essential to recognize that science thrives because of the unwavering commitment and tireless efforts of graduate students and postdoctoral researchers. They form the backbone of Canadian discovery, innovation, and economic growth. However, federal scholarships and fellowships have remained stagnant for 2 decades. These funding mechanisms have failed to keep up with the 48% inflation and 38% increase in tuition costs during that time. The consequences of this inadequate funding are severe. Federal scholarships hold significant prestige and serve as benchmarks for what universities consider reasonable minimum stipends. And unfortunately, these benchmarks for master's and doctoral students fall below the poverty line. According to a recent report published by the Institute for Research in Socioeconomic Information, the minimum amount required for a single person in Montreal to live with dignity is $32,535. After tuition, university fees, and insurance, my doctoral funding leaves me with only $20,000 per year to live on. Inadequate funding also compels graduate students and postdocs to seek better financial opportunities in the US, in Europe, or elsewhere, where there are paid stipends that reflect their merit and adequately cover the cost of living. Canada is falling behind its global counterparts in retaining talent. And if Canada genuinely values scientists, it must ensure that pursuing a PhD is a period of skill development, a stepping stone to greater achievements, not something to financially recover from. Dr. Douglas will now outline our specific recommendations.
Thank you. So my colleague has just highlighted the key issue. Canadian graduate and postdoctoral awards have not been adequately corrected for inflation since 2003, as we all know. An increase in tri-agency graduate scholarships and postdoctoral fellowships is crucially needed to adjust for the 48% inflation that has occurred over this period. Please note that we specify a distinction be made for doctoral awards, as we recommend PGSD awards be increased to $35,000 to align with the current value of the more prestigious CGSD awards. In addition to this increase in monetary value, an increase in the total number of awards is needed. Canada's population of graduate students and postdoctoral fellows has vastly outpaced the number of awards provided. To help address this issue, we recommend that the number of tri-agency graduate student scholarships be increased by 50% and the number of postdoctoral fellowships be doubled. We appreciate that federal research funding agencies cannot allocate funds they do not possess. So, in line with recommendations from fellow witnesses and the recent report by the advisory panel on the Federal Research Support System, we strongly recommend the tri-agency funding be increased by 10% every year for 5 years, with funding specifically allocated for graduate student stipends and postdoctoral fellows' salaries. These changes are needed to ensure that Canadians with high research potential are encouraged to receive advanced training and ultimately to explore the job market here in Canada instead of moving abroad where they may be more appropriately compensated. Thank you for inviting us to speak today, and we would be very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you to the witnesses, and we're right on time. But looking at the clock, we have about 32 minutes for our questioning rounds. So what I'm going to propose is that we have the first round at 5 minutes each, and then we'll trim off some time on the second round as well, so we can get in at 5 to the hour, as I said at the beginning. So if we could start off with Mr. Mazier, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for coming out today. This is really good. My first questions are to the Science and Policy Exchange. So I'm going to ask you a series of yes and no questions, and hopefully you can answer accordingly. Can you confirm that your organization submitted a pre-budget consultation in 2018 calling on the Liberal government to increase graduate and postdoctoral awards? Yes or no?
Yes.
Did the government act on this request?
No.
Can you confirm that your organization submitted a similar 2020 pre-budget consultation calling on the Liberal government to increase the value of student postdoctoral awards?
Yes.
And did the government act on that request?
No.
I think you know the next answer. Can you confirm that your organization called on the Liberal government in 2022 pre-budget consultation to increase the value of graduate, student, and postdoctoral awards?
Yes.
And did the government act on that request?
They did not, no.
And I find this quite surprising because, you know, the government knows how to spend money and run deficits. So why do you think the Liberal government has ignored your request and failed to listen to your voices?
Well, I think it's, first of all, this has been going on since 2003, this long-running process. So I would say it's been a failure of several governments over that time period. And I think it's a misunderstanding about what's needed for academic research, and that, as we've alluded to, the amount of federal funding in our research ecosystem is just really falling behind our international competitors. And so I believe it's a misunderstanding about how we should be prioritizing research funding, fundamentally.
But when you're asking for the particular ask,
yes,
and no one listens, why do you think that is? Is it just a misunderstanding? Or is it not a priority, or are they telling you one thing and not following through? Or
clearly it is not a priority, and I believe that that's an incorrect assessment of the situation because of the importance of being able to compete on an international stage with our research. And so I believe that's something we just have to get across, and I believe we have evidence to show that it should be a priority. So I think we can point to that.
Okay, thank you. Canadians across this country are feeling the impacts of generational cost of living crisis. Those on fixed incomes, including students, are suffering because of the government's inflationary policies. Last week, and we heard from students who shared heartbreaking stories on the reality that they are facing. 1 in 3 graduate students living on less than $1,300 a month. Students are turning to food banks as they can't afford the rising cost of groceries. And students are signing up for counseling as they are struggling to afford to live. And students are actually living in homeless shelters as the cost of rent has doubled. Ms. Lamframbos, and can you describe how the cost of living crisis combined with the government's funding freeze has impacted the well-being of students?
I think we've seen very clearly over the last few years, talking to graduate students myself, that students are struggling on many ways. They're struggling mentally, physically, emotionally, and financially. And I think financially is a big one that could be changed from the government's perspective as well. And this would impact a lot of these other ways. Mental health is a huge concern for graduate students. As you heard, 87% of graduate students had stress and anxiety about their finances alone. That's just about their finances. So imagine the stresses that they're feeling because of so many other reasons. I would emphasize that across the board, coast to coast to coast right now, graduate students are really, really struggling and they're feeling the impacts of this. I think it's really easy for us to sit in this room right now and not see that and not see them, but they are the foundations of research. They are the hands on the ground. They're the frontline workers of research, and I would just emphasize that if they struggle, the whole ecosystem struggles. Innovation in Canada struggles, and we will feel the impacts of that for generations to come.
I guess it's fair to say, though, the inflationary prices are definitely putting a strain on everybody. And I know, Ms. Andrade, did you want to add to that at all, as far as what this is causing to students?
About 30 seconds.
So, aligning with what my colleagues have said, I'd also say that from the flip side, we are advising people to take fewer graduate students because we need to be able to support them at a level where they can live. So I've done external reviews for departments where the graduate students are generally liking the program but are struggling in these ways, and we advise that they sometimes half the number of graduate students that they're actually taking in, which is going to have upstream very negative effects on the knowledge economy.
Yeah, it's basically just going to dry up the pipeline. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mazier. And now to Ms. Bradford, please. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses and to the gallery of students. We don't normally have people standing room only in our committee room, so welcome to you all. And Ms. Lavrambrose, welcome back, because as you mentioned before, you did participate in an earlier study, the Top Talent Research and Innovation. And so I am sure you're aware that as a result of that study, this committee did make 4 very specific recommendations, 4, 5, 7, and 9, that did make recommendations to address this underfunding situation. So I just wanted to mention that. I'm sure you're aware, but I wanted to assure the students and everyone else here in the room that you were heard before, because I do feel that we got a bit of a lecture, and I understand your frustration. So building on your testimony the last time, where you said only 33% of graduate students are actually supported directly through Tri-Council awards from one of the 3 federal granting agencies. The rest are supported indirectly through stipends provided from their supervisors, research grants, or departments. What sources of research funding are there for graduate students beyond master's and doctoral grants and scholarships?
A variety of different ways, and I think the complexities of this is probably why they haven't changed in a really long time. So the scholarships are a small aspect of it. In our survey, we found that 67% of students received a stipend directly from their supervisor, so this would be directly from that supervisor's research grant. 45% had funding coming from their department or faculty, and then 20% had a federal award, and 11% had a provincial award. Those numbers are going to vary depending on the data source, obviously, but in our survey, this was the breakdown of how students were funded. I think it's important to understand where that money is coming from when it is coming from a department or a faculty member, and that's coming through those grants. So at the end of the day, almost all research is coming from the Tri-Councils because they're either feeding through a graduate student indirectly or directly.
Understood. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah.
So for master's and doctoral students receiving stipends and pay from their supervisors, research grants, or departments, what salary range and average can they expect? And how does that work fit into their own studies and research?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So in our survey, we surveyed all students who got stipends, whether it was directly or indirectly through their TAG councils. So on average, we found that master's students were making $19,000 per year, and PhD students were making about $23,700 per year. So this would be taking into account students who are funded through the scholarships and indirectly through their supervisors.
Okay, thank you. So now, Professor Andre, also getting back to that same study we did, which was very informative, Andrea Wissard, she was a PhD student from University of Saskatchewan. Building on her testimony, I was just wondering, can you answer, how do other jurisdictions set scholarship and bursary values for graduate and postdoctoral researchers?
So there's a variety of different ways that they do it. There's some places in, I believe it's Norway, and I should have had this nailed down, where they actually just have a standard across all fields and as a function of your level. So you come in as a master's student, say, or as your first year your PhD, and you get a standard sort of stipend. It builds up as you move through the program, just like it would in any other field where you gain expertise and your work becomes more valuable as you get trained. And so that kind of approach is very common. And of course, places like the United States, some institutions have very deep pockets, so they're also providing funds out of, let's say, donations from alumni, et cetera, that can supplement these kinds of sources. And then there's TA-ships. So in our system, that happens as well. In other jurisdictions, there's a limit on how much TA-ship you do, whereas in Canada, quite often people make up the difference with not having to go to a food bank by doing many, many hours of TA-ships, teaching assistantships, which means less time for the research.
And of course, with our system here in Canada, because we have multiple jurisdictions, the provinces and territories are responsible essentially for operating costs for the post-secondary, so there's a great variance across the country as well, so it's hard to get universal standards. So how do postdoctoral fellowship monetary values impact in early career research? Oh, no, I think we know that, so I'm going to drop that question because I already know the answer, so never ask a question you know the answer to already. So now, Mr. Douglas, this one's for you. I just wondered if you could address that. So the government did recently announce the $1.4 billion through Canada First Research Excellent Fund. And while it may not solve the problem, how do investments like these support researchers?
Well, I think
15 seconds, please, Dr. Douglas.
So these are excellent investments, but they're insufficient for tackling this key issue. And so it's not that we don't value what the government is doing in funding these infrastructure and other elements of academic research, but it is insufficient for this key issue. And in the recent Federal Research Support System report, they referred to the potential for brain drain that's really unprecedented in Canadian history. So I think it really should be a priority.
Thank you.
Mr. Douglas, thank you.
Monsieur Blanchet-Joncav.
Mr. Blanchet-Joncav, you have 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. First of all, I want to commend everyone who came to this hall today. This is a very important study. You can see, Mr. Chairman, how important it is. I personally am the first graduate of my family, so I know exactly what it means to work and study at the same time. I also understand what it means to dream, to go to university. I worked for several years in my life, almost 10 years, to get enough money to accomplish my dream of going to university. So when I see these people here today, I'm very proud. I'm proud that they stand firm to send a message to government, of course, but also to affirm and insist that things must change. So thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I will now ask my questions. Of course, I want to acknowledge the presence of everyone here, especially Ms. Framboise. I want to thank you for your leadership in the Support Our Science movement. And before I forget, Mr. Chairman, I want to say that last week I was with them in the Hill because there were a ton of students from across the country who were asking for the indexation of scholarships. You know, Mr. Chairman, these students know exactly who were beside them in their struggle. And I have to say that members of government were invited, and I can confirm that they were not there. So when I hear from representatives of government that when they claim that they have already heard the problem and understand the problem, I don't really think they understand what the issue is. If it was really a priority for them, they would have been there alongside the students last week. So I would leave it there with respect to understanding priorities. You said that Canada is at a breaking point in terms of science and research, but my reading of this is more dramatic. I think that we may not have reached a breaking point. Canada is one of the only countries in the G7 countries that has not increased its investment in innovation over 20 years, because Canada is the only country that has lost researchers since 2016. Canada is forcing its best minds to live below the poverty line during their post-secondary studies. Let me give you a concrete example, Mr. Chairman. In 2003, a basket of goods and service cost $5. Now it costs $150.40. So that is a 50% increase. So by how many percent was the scholarship indexed over the 20 years? 0. So the calculation is quite easy here. 2023 budget was a perfect opportunity to respond to the investments of our counterparts in United Nations that invested considerably in research, but we invested $0. That is a complete abandonment of our researchers and our students. Professor Andral, what do you think about that?
I think that there's a problem with understanding the way that research is done. I, like my colleagues, applaud the investment in large, complex grants that allow people to come together across fields. Multidisciplinary research is the answer to the pressing problems of our times. It's no longer stay in your lane. But again, it needs to be understood that it's not the PIs who write those grants who are doing the work at the bench. And it needs to be understood that this amounts to exploitation of young people. So I do think that it's important that the 2023 budget did not see these issues as being sufficiently important to change the direction of the budget. And that's why we're here. That's why people who haven't protested in the past are here. That's why the Canadian Black Scientists Network is aligning with our colleagues, because we are, quite frankly, desperate.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Also, in your statement, you explained that it is quite concerning that highly qualified people have to make such a difficult choice, either between continuing to study or leaving Canada and going, for example, to the United States, where you said it's more attractive, the conditions there are better. Can you give more details about the conditions for doctoral students in the United States and compare that with Canada, please?
Right. So I will just say quickly, first I want to just make it clear that these aren't people who are seeking a lucrative career. Most scientists don't get a lucrative career and don't expect it. They just don't want to be below the poverty line. They want to be able to have a family, et cetera. And so the stipends are just much higher. There's more places where they waive your tuition fees. There's more places where there's subsidized housing, especially when you start looking at smaller institutions in Canada that can't afford that.
Thank you for doing that. Briefly, over to Mr. Cannings for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. And thank you to the witnesses for being here, and thank you to the young researchers for witnessing all this as well. It really means a lot to us. I'm going to start with Dr. Andrade. It's good to see you. I think we last saw each other at the Entomological Congress in Vancouver last year. So it's nice to see you here in Ottawa. And I really like the way that you framed this situation, where you pointed out that it's grad students that do the work, people do the work, and that if the government says that, research and science and innovation is a priority, then naturally people should be that priority. And also that the system is a filter, and it's not filtering based on talent, it's filtering based on ability to pay through other means, and that leaves so many people behind. And I'm just give you a couple minutes to expand on that.
Right. So our members, I actually surveyed our members, and a lot of young people did come forward. And there were several classes. There were international students who'd come here hoping to make a life in Canada, doing important research in things like conservation and things like cancer research, et cetera, who said, this isn't what I expected. Some of them were postdocs who had previously been in the UK and had families. And they came here and said, I actually can't live this way. I have to leave Canada. So there's that. We're losing the ability to draw in new talent. Then there's the homegrown talent, the people who said, I grew up in rural Canada, was actually fairly common. My family has to pay for me to get to a major center where there's a university in the first place, and then I can't afford to live there. And so again, I need to just get a job. I mean, it's very, very common. So we're trying to raise money for fellowships ourselves, right? And that's just not an easy thing to do when you're a not-for-profit.
Right. Well, thank you. And I now want to turn to Ms. Laframboise and thank you for the work you've done on this issue and for helping organize the walkout that happened last week. Mm-hmm. You've been involved in this for a while. You outlined some of the things that you've done, the letter, the petition, rallies last year, the rallies and walkouts this year. Just wondering if you could let me know what, and I assume you've met with government representatives. I'm just wondering what response you get from them. What is their answers to your direct ask? And what, for instance, what was the response to the petition? Just so that I have some idea of why this is not happening.
Mm-hmm. No, and thank you for that question. I think this is what happened on last Friday with the CFREF announcement is a perfect example of what the government's reaction to this has been. I think it's keen and it's easy to say that we have invested in science. We have these great infrastructure projects that are, with no doubt, going to happen and will provide some sort of infrastructure for science. But I think it goes back to what was said earlier. These institutes will be empty. There'll be no students to come and work there who can actually afford to be there anymore. So I think last year when we did the rallies, we spoke on Quirks and Quarks podcast, and Minister Champagne was quoted on there saying that he was our ally and we were going to hold the throne of Canada's innovation. And I completely agree. That's what I want too. And I think we can't do that without investing in graduate students. We can have all these great infrastructure projects and micro projects and these little investments into microscience, but the graduate students are the ones doing this. And as long as their pay does not change, nothing else is going to change.
You have a minute.
Okay. Well, then I'll turn to Dr. Douglas and Ms. Messina Pacheco. Just to get more background on how our system compares with the United States. We've had the big CHIPS investments in the States that have seen huge increases in research support, and what that means, just to give you some chance to elaborate on the draw of Canadians to the United States, or what are our competitors doing?
Absolutely. I mean, so one aspect I'll mention, and I'll pass it over to my colleague, is just that in the U.S., NSF Graduate Research Fellowship Program is kind of the equivalent to the tri-agency grants. The equivalent of Canadian dollars is just under $50,000 per year. So it gives you an idea of the difference in these prestigious scholarship students are receiving. And I believe my colleague can speak to the rest of your question.
Thank you, Gavin. There have been, as others have mentioned, the percent GDP that Canada is investing in research and development is far below the OECD average. So that is a direct comparison to other countries that are equivalent to us and what they are putting into their researchers that we absolutely are not.
Thank you. Thank you for
probably.
that. And if there's detailed numbers you'd like to send in to the clerk, please do that. The second round, we're going to trim 20% and go to 4 minutes, 4 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes, and starting with Mr. Soroka for 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I'll just ask one quick question here. The Prime Minister in this government stands before the Canadians and says, "We're here for Canadians, we've got their backs, and we're going to make lives better." Do you believe this statement to be true in your situation? Anyone want to answer it?
The short answer is no. I think maybe he thinks...
I'm just looking for short answers, please.
I think he thinks it is.
Okay.
I think there's an opportunity for the answer to be yes.
Yeah.
That's why we're here.
That's a very political answer. Yes.
I agree. I think this is a political question, and I would say that in our particular case, it is obviously
That's fine.
We
then.
do not agree.
I'll cede my time to Mr. Maxime Blanchard.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je vais
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm going to continue with my questioning to Ms. Laframboise. You know, Canada is among the last countries in the OECD countries. So we have the least number of graduates in higher education. We know the consequences of not indexing scholarships over 20 years now. We know what it means for financial precarious situations. We know what it means for mental health and brain drain. So what do you think, as a representative of Support Our Science, those people who don't have parents who can support them financially, who have to give up on higher education for several years, as I did? I spent 10 years gathering money to continue my dream of going to university. How can a G7 country discriminate against students that is sieving between those who are from more privileged families and less privileged families? There are many people who are in rural Canada who have to move and have to struggle to make ends meet. You had data that people give up on higher education because they don't have enough financial support.
Yeah, I think it comes down to who we are allowing to do a graduate degree now. And I think, look at myself as one example of many other stories that exist, but should it cost $100,000 in debt to get a PhD? Especially if we're looking at my prospects for a career, I'm probably, if I wanted to continue on in science, I would do a postdoc and make $45,000 a year and continue to have to start paying off my debt. These students and postdocs are young adults. They are late 20s, early 30s. They often have dependents. They want to invest the same way their peers do, and they want to be functional young adults in society, and that's not possible right now. So you're right. It's going to eliminate people who don't want to take on all of those burdens. And in our survey, this was shown many times. Home ownership is one that comes to mind. I know this was brought up in the committee before. 80% of our graduate students rent. Only 10% own their homes. These are like early 30s students. This is unprecedented compared to the national averages, which we are already concerned about. So I think examples like this show just like what that impact is on the students and postdocs.
30 seconds.
Merci beaucoup. Écoutez, j'ai
Thank you very much. Well, I met many people who were thinking about giving it all up, and I met some who had given it up. So what do you think, as a representative of Support Our Science, what do the students say about how urgent it is to act now?
Feeling the direct impacts of this right now. They're living it, and every year that we don't invest is one less student who will continue on doing this and one less innovator that we're going to get at the end of the day. So who knows who we're losing? It might be the next cancer research. We don't know.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Souza for 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for your presentations, your passion, your engagement, the people you brought with you to provide support. Notwithstanding the cuteness of the opposition, there is a collaborative effort by all parties to try to do what's best for our families. Because I have kids, I got nephews, I got members who are PhD students. They're struggling. They're trying to make a go of it, and they're getting by somehow. And some of them have moved off to the East Coast, and they were teachers, they were professors, they were teachers. They went through the process that you're engaging. And certainly the government has increased funding in infrastructure beyond other things, whereas the opposition have asked for cuts. We've actually been increasing, but not near enough, given why you're here and why we've called this meeting. That's right. So we want to see this improve. We really do. And I just want to ask, Professor, you said something which I want to clarify. What makes Canada competitive? You're saying we're not. So what is it that's missing? Obviously, you've made recommendations, and we've heard you now, but what makes us competitive versus the United States, Australia, elsewhere?
I'd have to say I actually think Canadians do a lot with a little. Our grants are small, and yet we punch above our weight on an international scale. So that's great. But there is a gap between science and innovation right now in Canada relative to other countries, and that's been shown in numerous reports, including some from the CCA. What we need is actually more going into the pipeline, because really you don't know where the innovation is going to come that's going to result in a COVID vaccine, right? That was someone who toiled in the trenches for decades with very little payoff, actually losing her grants in the United States. So we need more people, and we need more people with new ideas in order to make that jump into something that's innovative for a challenge that we haven't even met yet.
Julia, Gavin, I know it's sensitive for time, and the recommendations are put out. What's the total amount that's involved here? Like, what are we asking for? When you increase the numbers of students and applications, and then you increase the 40 to 50% funding, how much of a dollar value are we talking?
Yeah, thanks for
And
that
will the
question.
opposition support it?
Well, that second question, I would defer to people with political expertise to answer that.
I'm kidding.
I
Just
will
get to-
speak to the. So the current tri-agency budget for 2022-2023 was $3.72 billion. So for our recommendations based on increasing the tri-agency awards and increasing the number of awards, that would be $134 million to increase that. And if you're talking about the increase to tri-agency, the budget, so if a 10% increase, that corresponds to about $441.7 million increased in starting in 2023, 2024, and that would be compound over 5 years.
Are you
So that
saying
would increase.
$3.7 billion is
That's
what we're giving
that's
now?
Yes. Yeah.
And you want it to go up to $5 billion?
Well,
I'm looking at 40%.
Yeah, so essentially, eventually, yes. If we do that 10% increase compound, yeah.
Julia, anything more? Good luck, by the way.
So I would say that this may seem like a large number, but it corresponds to the 20 years neglect. So that's why a large investment is now needed.
I'm not questioning it. I'm just trying to get specifically. Yeah. And I'm asking Julia Pacheco, as a candidate, PhD candidate, you know what you're getting into, right? Absolutely. You want to make certain you have good quality of life as you proceed.
Absolutely. And so far, that is not looking good. As I think Professor Andrade mentioned, we do not get into this business because we think it is lucrative. We know that it isn't. And in fact, we have data to show that the median salary of PhD holders in Canada across all disciplines is about $80,000 per year. But when you look at specifically STEM disciplines and science disciplines, you're looking at only $50,000 per year. So,
thank you. Thank you, Mr. Souza. And for 2 minutes, Mr. Blanchet-Choca.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much. I'll continue with my questions. I like having data. I'm someone who loves facts and figures, and it's very strange to understand how a government can invest $0. You can invest $100,000, but zero will not change anything. And when you're the only G7 country that doesn't invest and has the lowest percentage of investment in R&D in comparison with the other countries, well, you can see how much you invested. When you're the only G7 countries that it's not taking care of its researchers, well, the result is clear. We talked about the United States that is very attractive for researchers. They doubled their biggest program, that is Science Act via CHIPS. And so those researchers who are ambitious and talented will go south to do their research. And Canada will likely become more of a scientific colony, and that is what Mr. Chad Galford said. He came here in committee and shared and testified his opinion with us. So maybe the people of the organization can tell us what they think about the situation.
About 45 seconds.
I think I actually missed the key part of the question. I apologize.
Donc,
Well,
Quickly, to give an example of what this looks like, a PhD student in the United States right now with an NSF grant will make $65,000. The awards in Canada are $21,000. So that alone is going to drive people away. The National Institute for Health as well gives a $52,000 salary for a PhD student and a $70,000 to $85,000 salary for a postdoc. this is uncomparable to Canada. This is nearly double the salary. So it makes sense that they're not staying in Canada.
Thank you. And wrapping up our 2 minutes with Mr. Cannings, please.
Well, thank you, and I'm going to turn to Dr. Andrade again. Just to get some more details, I was a bit surprised to hear that you've been talking to departments or researchers about taking fewer grad students. I assume concurrent with that would be a policy of paying them more so they could live a dignified life. So I just wanted to get the details on that, and just to follow up on that, if everybody started doing that, how would that affect our science ecosystem in Canada?
Right. So that referred to, so every graduate and undergraduate department in the country has to periodically be reviewed by external reviewers. And it was in that context that I and colleagues from University of Alberta and Western went to an institution that I won't name and discovered how desperately poor their graduate students were, because scientists take a long time to change, and they were still accepting students at the levels they had previously, even though their grants had flattened out and expenses had gone up. And our recommendation was you have to pay these students a living wage. You have to give them more money, which means taking fewer students. And for most of the institutions I've seen across Canada, I would have the same recommendation. And I think that even though we're slow at making change, as this kind of movement makes it more and more clear to PIs that their students are struggling to this extent, going to food banks, this is going to happen across the country, and it's going to gut our innovation ecosystem.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a minute that Mr. Cannings has given me, and I'm thinking back to the 1970s when I was studying, and I remember those years and the years of early marriage, cashing in the beer bottles so we could get the gas for the car to go and watch a non-black and white TV. The solutions need to be in front of us, and we need to find those solutions together. So thank you for the witnesses to work on this problem with us, and to the guests that have come to see us deliberate on this. We will continue our deliberations on this study. We will move forward and get a report back that will be public, and we'll continue to work together. So thank you for that. Now we're going to move to a next part of the meeting, which is a fairly brief part, hopefully. It's the project budget for the study that we're doing. We have circulated a budget. Is that something we can... Parliamentary studies like this budget in front of us is $23,000 to help for the people to come as witnesses and to pay for the running of the meeting. So we've got agreement around the room to... Great. Thank you. And thank you to the clerk for preparing that.
Mr. Chair, point of order.
Yeah, Mr. Mazier.
I just have a request, a motion I want to put forward to on the written response from UBC in Calgary, if it could be made public.
Okay, any written responses that we get will be put onto our website, and we'll make sure that they're public as well.
Okay.
Thank you. The next part is Thursday, May 11th. We'll be resuming this study, and we'll also be providing drafting instructions to support the IP commercialization report, the work that we did previous to this study, and considering also the International Moonshot Program's draft report. So that's the work ahead of us on Thursday. So shall we adjourn? Okay, thank you. Thank you again to the witnesses from both panels, and great questions by the members.